Should any king take up arms against another, all should unitedly arise and prevent him. If this be done, the nations of the world will no longer require any armaments, except for the purpose of preserving the security of their realms and of maintaining internal order within their territories. This will ensure the peace and composure of every people, government, and nation. We fain would hope that the kings and rulers of the earth, the mirrors of the gracious and almighty name of God, may attain unto this station and shield mankind from the onslaught of tyranny. Baha'u'llah. Should anyone among you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is naught but manifest justice. Baha'u'llah.
This week is Miss Sovaida Maani, and her topic is the use of force ever justified? Sovaida Maani Ewing is an international lawyer with 20 years of experience in public and private legal practice. She's also the founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, a virtual think tank, an online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. She has published 5 books in the area of peace and global governance, including Building a World Federation, The Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. Her latest book, available on Amazon, is The Alchemy of Peace: 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace. She also hosts a popular monthly podcast, available on most platforms, that is dedicated to creating a vision of the world we want and infusing hope that we can make the choices necessary to attain it. Sovaida is also a certified mediator and a life mastery coach. And with that, I'll hand it off to Miss Maani.
Good morning, everyone. At least good morning where we are. Good afternoon or evening if you're elsewhere in the world. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for showing up on a Sunday. All right, let's dive into the topic. Is the use of force ever justified? I want to start by prefacing my remarks with the following. Let's remember that anything and everything that we talk about today applies only to those who have embraced the Baha'i faith. In other words, these are principles that we have chosen to espouse, and we do not impose them on others. We do not seek to, but we do offer them because we believe that they could contribute to the betterment of the world. So for those who are investigating the Baha'i faith, please know that these are ideas that you may want to reflect upon, read more about in the Baha'i writings and elsewhere, and to engage in social discourse about. Okay, let me remember to share my screen. I'm not very good at multitasking. Here we go. All right, there is our topic. So I'm going to divide my remarks into 2 big buckets, essentially. In the first bucket, we're going to explore the principles governing the use of force by individuals, and then we'll get to the use of force by society, by rulers, by leaders, and so on, which I suspect is something that most of you are interested in, given what's been going on in the world and continues to happen. But this is the foundation. So it starts with the foundational principle in the Baha'i writings that the use of force against another is a flagrant transgression of the Baha'i teachings. In his most holy book, the Kitab Aqdas, which is the Baha'i Book of Laws, Baha'u'llah says, "Let none contend with another, and let no soul slay another." So this is the foundational principle. And then he says, "What? Would ye kill him whom God hath quickened, whom he hath endowed with spirit through a breath from him?" So in some sense, like, how dare we humans arrogate to ourselves the right to take away a life that has been bestowed by God? That this is, it gives you the sense of how reprehensible this act is and how strongly forbidden it is. In a letter by the governing body of the Baha'i Faith, the Universal House of Justice, they say this: "The use of force by the physically strong against the weak as a means of imposing one's will and fulfilling one's desires is a flagrant transgression of the Baha'i teachings." So again, as we think about this in terms of how individuals act towards each other, you can also start to see how these foundational principles apply in the context of international relations and in the context of everything that's going on in our world. The use of force by the physically strong against the weak in order to impose their will and get what they want. So if we want to know kind of what the contours are of the principles for Baha'is, that's where we begin. Now, this isn't surprising because the standard set for Baha'is in the Baha'i writings is extremely high. Not only are we forbidden to take life and to slay another, but we are forbidden from engaging in contention and argumentation. Wow. So imagine if we're not even allowed to enter into what is called acrimonious debate with others, how much more so are we forbidden to use force against them? So I find this very interesting because that for Baha'is is where it all begins. And why are both these topics often discussed by Baha'u'llah in the same phrase, contention and conflict, as you see the quote here on the screen, the people of God are forbidden to engage in contention and conflict because they both undermine the core central purpose of the faith, the reason why Baha'u'llah's come to unify humanity. Argumentation and acrimonious debate undermine that, as does conflict. All right. In fact, an interesting anecdote. In the early days of Baha'u'llah's revelation, there were some prominent teachers of the cause in Iran who were divided. They were arguing about the station of Baha'u'llah. And so they wrote to him, they said, okay, you adjudicate. You tell us which of us is right. And here's what he said. His response was that if they were united, both sides were right, even though they're taking opposing viewpoints. But if they're united, both sides are right. And if they were divided, even if one of them was right, technically, they were both wrong. So this demonstrates that unity is really the linchpin concern for Baha'is. That's the standard in which we weigh everything we do. Is this action that I'm about to take, is it conducive to unity? If so, I can go ahead with it. If not, then I don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Now, the prohibition against contention applies even when we are defending the faith. Here's a wonderful quotation from the Universal House of Justice, saying that for Baha'is to go further by engaging in acrimonious debate, much less by reflecting on the character of others, would be to cross the line that separates legitimate defense of the faith from contention. And we have seen that the Baha'is in Iran, who've been persecuted for at least roughly 50 years and more, but more intensely persecuted over the last 47 years or so, that they have been very careful never to cross this line. They're always respectful of and they honor their leaders. They speak up, they share their concerns, they present reasoned arguments, but they never engage in acrimonious debate, much less conflict. They do not take up arms to rise in revolution against any government anywhere, including in Iran. Okay. Now, one of the main laws of Baha'u'llah, according to him, is that in this dispensation, he's abrogated the law of holy war, which has been used by other faiths. You know, the Christians engaged in their crusades and, the Muslims engaged in jihad and holy war. And Baha'u'llah says that this is absolutely forbidden to Baha'is. So remember again, we're not even allowed to engage in contention and acrimonious debate about our faith, let alone to use the sword in order to convert people. It's just out of the question. But what's interesting is what he goes on to say. He says he's replaced the sword with the sword of the tongue, with the sword of utterance, which he says is the way to conquer people's hearts. But more than this, even better than the sword of the tongue, he says, is the sword of understanding. This is where the Baha'is live, right? This is the space. seeking to create understanding. As Abdu'l-Baha says in a wonderful passage, he says that the whole role of the Baha'is on planet Earth is to harmonize differences. So when we look in our country, in the United States, at the extreme polarization, say between the parties, the Democrats and Republicans, and between people on a whole range of issues, what is our job? Certainly not to take sides. We're forbidden from political partisanship, but to harmonize the differences. And it's not an easy job, but it's a very satisfying and fulfilling work to engage in. All right. Now, here's the second principle. Individuals are prohibited from taking revenge on each other or vengeance. Abdu'l-Baha has a lovely quote. He gives an example. I'm going to use Americanized names. He says, if the son of John kills the son of Peter, Peter doesn't have the right to kill the son of John. If he does so, that's vengeance, and it's reprehensible. Then he says, this is what should be done. They must return good for evil. So Peter has to return good for evil and not only forgive, but if possible, be of service to his oppressor. Then he explains, and this is for now, this is the key explanation that I'd like us to focus on. He says the two actions are equivalent. They're both wrong. If one action is reprehensible, he says, both are reprehensible. And the only difference is that one was committed first in time, and then the next one was committed. This is a very alien way of thinking. Our society today thinks in terms of the ends justify the means. And in terms of retaliation, you did this to my son, so I'm entitled to do this to your son. And whatever it takes, I'll do to win. Abdu'l-Baha says, no, if it's wrong, it's wrong, whoever does it, and in whatever circumstance, and whether it's one person does it first or one person does it second. And here's another quote. This one really puts this in high relief. Beware, beware, lest any of you seek vengeance, even against one who is thirsting for your blood. Again, how diametrically opposite this approaches to what we see in the world around us. Okay, so we now know what we're not allowed to do. So what are we supposed to do? And we have the power of choice. Let's start with that. Abdu'l-Baha reminds us that human beings have a dual nature, the animal nature and the spiritual nature. He says, man is the highest degree of materiality and at the beginning of spirituality. So we stand here at the point where spirituality starts and materiality ends. So in any given moment when we make a decision, we can either make a decision that turns towards our animal side or make a decision that engages our spiritual side. And he says, our goal and the goal of revelation is to train us so that our angelic side will overcome our animal side. So what does this mean in practice? These are all very nice words, but what are we told we should do? So can't use force, can't engage in acrimonious debate, can't take revenge. We know all the can't. So what do we do? Here are 3 or 4 things that the writings specifically tell us to do. So when conflict arises between individuals, the first thing you do, Baha'u'llah says, he says, behold me standing before your face and overlook the faults of one another for my sake, for Baha'u'llah's sake, as a token of our love for him and for the faith. So that is the standard that the Baha'is have set for themselves or have embraced. Second thing we're supposed to do is to forgive. Now, this quote from Abdu'l-Baha, I've read this many times before, but as I was preparing for today's conversation, it really made me sit up because I was thinking, okay, Sovaida, how good are you at doing this? He says, if someone commits an error and wrong toward you, you must instantly forgive. Now, it's interesting because in some recent works I read by psychotherapists, because I also have a coaching practice, so I'm always interested to see what the new ideas are that are floating around. You know, psychologists say, don't worry if somebody asks for your forgiveness, don't instantly forgive because that can't possibly be genuine. You should take your time and really process. And then eventually, slowly, you come to forgiveness, and then it's genuine. That's what they've decided. But look at the standard that we have as Baha'is in the faith. Abdullah says if someone commits an error and wrong toward you, you must instantly forgive them. So that's the first thing. And then in another quote, he says, if you do that, it shows the greatest mercy. So we're evincing the quality, the divine quality of mercy. And he says that is worthy of admiration. And then he says something else that's really sweet. I mean, Abdul Baha was so loving and tender. He says, you should endeavor that all the nations and communities of the world. Now, this applies to what's going on in our world. So if you want to let your minds go there for a second, it says, endeavor that all the nations and communities of the world, even the enemies, so Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, Israel, the Iranians against the people of Iran against their government at the moment, wherever you go, America versus Venezuela, pick your fight in the world. So even for the enemies, you want them to put their trust, assurance, and hope in you. Can you imagine the Ukrainians putting their trust, assurance, and hope in the Russians or vice versa? But that is the standard Baha'u'llah sets for Baha'is. That if a person falls into errors for 100,000 times, he may yet turn his face to you, hopeful that you will forgive his sins, as opposed to say, 10 years ago, your people did this to me. 20 years ago, you guys did that. And the other says, well, 100 years ago, you did that. And then you go on. And before we know it, we're, in a 1,000-year-old conflict. And everyone's saying, but your great, 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 great grandparents did this to me. Hopeful that you will forgive his sins. For why? Now, this is the sweetness here. For this enemy must not become hopeless, neither grieved nor despondent. Oh my goodness. What a standard. We don't want our enemies to become hopeless or grieved or despondent, let alone killing them, right? We're not even at the point now of taking the sword out. This is the conduct and the manner of the people of Baha. So obviously, these are the goals towards which we strive. Baha'is do not claim to be perfect, but this is the destination towards which we're working. This is the goal towards which we're striving, not eviscerating the other side. Now, why are we urged to forgive? It's worth reflecting for a second. The House of Justice answered this question beautifully in a letter it wrote. This is the Universal House of Justice. They say that forgiveness is an essential part of the spiritual growth of a person who has been wronged. So if I've been wronged, my forgiving you, if you've wronged me, is part of my spiritual growth. So I'm doing it at least because I love myself and I want to spiritually grow. And they go on to say that overlooking the sins of another removes bitterness from the soul and both ennobles and strengthens it. And folks, this ties into what we know as Baha'is and believe that the whole purpose of our existence is to prepare for the afterlife, to develop those spiritual qualities that Abdu'l-Baha says constitute the essential limbs that are necessary for progress in the afterlife. Those limbs include limbs like forgiveness and detachment and self-sacrifice and love of God and so on, and compassion. So doing this we're not just charitably doing something for someone else, it's going to redound to our own benefit. We're assuring our growth through all the worlds of God, through eternity, as opposed to taking vengeance and attaining a short-term gain in this life with long-term adverse consequences for our souls through the worlds of God. This puts me in mind of a statement by Nelson Mandela. I love this quote from him. He said, bearing resentment against your enemy or somebody else is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. Think about it. Think about those times when you have felt resentment towards somebody and then been really angry because they don't seem to notice or they don't seem to care. Yeah, because it's not affecting them, but guess who it's affecting? it's affecting ourselves, right? We feel the churning and we get sick and we get ulcers and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the next stage is beyond forgiving. We can do something even better, and that is to understand and not even be hurt in the first place. Because if you're not hurt, you don't even need to forgive. Wow, there's something that really causes us to stop and think. So there are thoughts attributed to the greatest holy leaf, the sister of Abdu'l-Baha and the daughter of the prophet founder Baha'u'llah, in which apparently she used to say that to be hurt and to forgive is saintly, but far beyond this is the power to comprehend and not be hurt. And then she explains, you see, this is someone who really has perception. She says it's not that we make the best of things, like, okay, this has happened, now let me just make the best of it. No, it's not a dull resignation. But she says that we may find in everything, even in calamity, the germ of enduring wisdom. It's not so much to be long-suffering, she says, as a quiet awareness of the forces that operate in the hours, days, or years of waiting and inactivity. We ought to move with the larger rhythm, the wider sweep towards our ultimate goal in that complete acquiescence, that perfect accord which underlies the spirit of the faith itself. And folks, this applies right now as we as Baha'is observe what's going on in the world, and many are perturbed, understandably, regardless of the country we're looking at, whether it's the United States, whether it's Iran, whether it's Venezuela, Ukraine, etc., to understand that there is a larger story here and a larger, deeper wisdom, and that we need to be patient. And meanwhile, as we exercise patience and wait, we endeavor to make the world a better place. In other words, we're not paralyzed. That's not patience. That is becoming useless. But we assiduously work, and in fact, we raise our level of activity, knowing that this process of disintegration is absolutely necessary to the process of integration. I was just saying to one of the hosts before we started that, yes, the situation of the world is bad, but what did we think was going to happen when Baha'u'llah says, soon will the old order be rolled up and a new one spread out in its stead? When you're going to roll up a carpet, you're not going to say, well, I'll take this piece of it, cut this out, and leave it on the floor, and no, the whole thing goes and you get rid of it. So it's fascinating to see how this rolling up is taking place completely out of our control, as is appropriate. Shoghi Effendi says that the greater plan of God is in the hands of God, and he is working through the systems in the world, economic, social, political. Baha'is keep completely out of that, and we focus on building something new, the new carpet that will be rolled out in its stead, which is the work we're doing. All right, and then the last thing, new spiritual reaction that we're called upon to adopt, because as humanity, we're now approaching our maturity. So mature behavior, maturity dictates new mature behaviors. And one of these behaviors is to seek to be of service to the oppressor. So not only do we not want to decimate the oppressor, not only do we forgive them, not only, even better, are we not hurt by them so we don't have to forgive them, but we then go one step further and seek to be of service. I would posit that the Baha'i community in Iran has been a wonderful role model in this regard too. This community that has been relentlessly persecuted for all these decades, what have they done? Not only have they not revolted, not only have they not wished their government ill, and not only have they forgiven and sought to understand, but they've gone that extra step consistently and engaged in activities to seek the unification of their communities around them, to instill morality and moral education in the children, to instill a spirit of service in the young, to instill a spirit of love and unity. That is amazing. That is a model that is, I have no doubt in generations to come, that is worth studying and emulating. Okay, let's move on. So the Baha'i Faith doesn't just stop at telling us what to do and what not to do in terms of when there's conflict between individuals, but provides us with an extremely effective tool and a radically new tool that we call Baha'i consultation for resolving conflicts. I'm not going to get into the details of it. I gave a whole presentation here on Baha'i Faith Modern Perspectives. I think it was called Consultation as an Expression of Justice. So if you're interested to understand what Baha'i consultation is about and the contours of it, feel free to go back and revisit that video. But what consultation does writ large is, according to the writings, it bestows greater awareness. So we understand better. Before we make decisions about how to deal with a problem or conflict, we need to understand, and it transmutes conjecture into certitude. I want to just pause for a second on the word conjecture. Folks, conjecture, another way of thinking about it, is making assumptions, is one of the biggest landmines we all have in our lives. We're constantly engaged in our personal lives and at the international level, but let's stick with the personal for now, in assuming. We assume the reason that we know why this person did what they did. We assume that we know what's going on in this person's mind. We assume that we understand a whole bunch of things. And then we act based on the assumption, which is just a product of our imagination. And we get ourselves into lots of hot water because the other party also engages in assumptions. So now you've got a battle of assumptions as opposed to a battle race based on reality. So by using the tool of consultation, we can get rid of our assumptions, park them, and focus on seeing, the House of Justice says, learn to read reality. That's what it means. Don't make assumptions. See reality for what it is, investigate it, and use the tool of consultation. By the way, side note for those of you who are interested in these things, there was a report produced last year by the CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a fantastic report. I did an entire podcast on this, so go to Reimagining Our World podcast and take a look if you're interested. But here's what he said. He kicked off his report with this statement by Drucker, Peter Drucker, an Austrian, who said that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence itself. So our world is turbulent, right? The biggest danger is not that turbulence. So what is it? He says, acting on the basis of old assumptions, using logic of the past to dictate the future. Wow. And then there's a whole big explanation. As I said, if you're interested, you can go and listen to the podcast. But that's fascinating. And it completely dovetails with what we've seen here. So consultation is the tool, it's the prophylactic tool we use to avoid slipping into making false assumptions, transmutes conjecture into certitude. And the final quote is, the maturity of the gift of understanding is made manifest through consultation. All right. What do we do when a third party is injured? So let's say that I'm standing here and I watch Bayan. Sorry, Bayan, I'm going to use you as an example. Bayan starts slapping one of you around and beating on you. Okay. Can I say, oh, Baha'u'llah's told me to forgive, so I forgive Bayan, right? In fact, I understand he had a rotten childhood. Hey, I'm just not that he did, I'm just saying, okay? These are the excuses we use in society. The person had a bad childhood, they were born in a bad neighborhood, or a parent was an alcoholic, or whatever the story is. So no big surprise that they turned out the way they did. They were abused, so now the abused has become the abuser, etc., etc. As Baha'is, so this is so interesting now because now we see a shift. We've gone from I forgive Bayan to the Baha'i principle is I have two responsibilities at this point. First, I have to immediately step in and prevent Bayan from doing what he's doing, if possible. Secondly, I then have to report him to the relevant authorities and institutions. So we've gone from I forgive you and I let go, so forgiveness and detachment, to I step in, I actively engage to prevent, and if I cannot prevent, then to report a crime or a serious misconduct. Wow. So Abdu'l-Baha actually puts this in case, just so that we know that we're not confused. So he says, Sovaida, maybe you misread the writings. So this is what Abdu'l-Baha says. He says, if one person assaults another, the injured one should forgive him. But the communities must protect the rights of man. So if someone assaults, injures, oppresses, and wounds me, this is Abdu'l-Baha talking, I will offer no resistance and I will forgive him. But if a person wishes to assault the fellow who was next to him, Sayyid Manshadi in this case, certainly I will prevent him. And then he explains, I love it because Abdu'l-Baha always explains the rationale. He says, because although for the malefactor, so for Bayan here, non-interference is apparently a kindness. Sure, he'd love to get away with it. He'd love it if I sat back and said, oh, not my business, I forgive Bayan. Yet Abdu'l-Baha says it would be an oppression to Manshadi, the guy who's being beaten up. And then Abdu'l-Baha says, if I abandoned you to this person who's attacking you, that would not be justice, but it would be injustice. Wow. Now that's a new and interesting facet of justice. By the way, this is reminiscent of a law that we have, at least in the United States, and I know it exists in England, that if you aid and abet a crime, even though you don't actually commit the crime, but you aid and abet it, you are held responsible as a principal, as though you had actually committed the crime. So we see that even in legal thinking, this idea of justice is present. It gets more complicated, but that I just wanted to have kind of highlighted that. Okay. Now here's another exception. So standing is in the to protect a third party was one exception. Here's another exception. We are permitted to act in self-defense. So Shoghi Effendi wrote to Baha'is in Britain at some point and said, look, you guys keep telling everyone that Baha'is are forbidden to engage in self-defense. I think you need to be careful. You're overstating it and you're taking things too literally. That's the word he uses, taking too literally. And he says, to put it bluntly, he fears that the question might be misunderstood by the Baha'is. He says Baha'u'llah could surely have not meant that a Baha'i should not attempt to defend his life against any irresponsible assailant who might attack him for any purpose whatever, whether religious or not. Every reasonable person would feel under such circumstances justified in protecting life. So that's the principle. In a tablet by Abdu'l-Baha, he gives an example of if a Baha'i is attacked by highway robbers, they shouldn't surrender themselves, but the Baha'i should try as far as circumstances permit to defend himself and then again later lodge a complaint with the authorities. This is really important because Baha'is truly believe in law and order and obedience to government and in having systems in place. And so we use those systems. We don't just say, no, I didn't want to say anything. Didn't, you know, why? It's not my place. No, it is our place. We're told that we need to be doing this. All right. So here are the rules. These are, it's a really interesting balancing act. So I can act in self-defense, but as I think about how to go about this, there's certain principles that I need to balance. It's better to be killed than to kill, according to Baha'u'llah. That's a statement from Baha'u'llah, especially in the context of religious persecution. Second principle, my response has to be proportionate to the offense. So now I have to really be careful because what I'm trying to guard against is the third thing on the screen, against slipping into retaliation, even if someone is thirsting for my blood. So isn't that interesting? It's very hard to do, especially in the moment. When one is feeling righteous indignation and anger, like, I can't believe you just attacking me and my family. And we start defending ourselves, remembering to be proportionate and constantly checking in with our consciences to make sure it's like, have I repelled the attack and now I can be done? Or am I now going after the guy or the people because I'm just so angry and I want to make sure that they never live another day to do something similar, as opposed to then calling the authorities. We see this in police shows, right? The person who's bludgeoning the offender to death, and the police person comes and says, wait, 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 we've arrested them. There's no need for you to continue. So it's that sort of scenario. So it's a question of judgment. So again, a side note, please notice that this revelation that has come at this point in this stage of humanity's collective evolution comes as we approach the stage of our collective maturity. And one will find in the writings many instances in which the outside, the hard rules, the boundaries are set, the black lines of the law. But then within those black lines, there's a lot of scope for maneuver and exercise of conscience. And that's what you do. That's the difference between the parent of a 3-year-old stopping the 3-year-old from doing, almost constantly guiding them, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. And then when the person is 15, you're not doing that anymore. You're setting the hard rules, but then within it, you're trying to train that young person to exercise good judgment because they have to go off and live their lives eventually, and they can't have mom and dad constantly telling them, do this, do that, do the other. Okay. What do we do as individual Baha'is in response to religious persecution? Baha'u'llah says it's preferable to be killed in the path of God's service than to kill, and that organized religious attacks against Baha'is should never turn into any kind of warfare, as this is strictly prohibited. So there are no ifs, ands, or buts. This is one of those hard black line rules, strictly prohibited in the writings. And again, see the experience of the Baha'is in Iran as a wonderful example of that. Tied to all this is another cardinal law in the Baha'i faith, that we are basically forbidden to carry arms. And I love this quote from Baha'u'llah. He says, gracious God, this people need no weapons of destruction, inasmuch as they have girded themselves to reconstruct the world. So we're engaged in active building and reconstruction. We're not engaged in the process of demolishing and decimating. Their hosts, the hosts of the Baha'is, are the hosts of goodly deeds, and their arms, the arms of upright conduct. So now, exceptions to the rule, we talked about a self-defense. Now, when there is no lawful authority to appeal to, Baha'is are allowed to carry and use weapons. So in the case of massive civil disorder, where basically order has collapsed, there's no police force to look to, there's nobody around to help you, you're basically out on your own, we can do that. Interestingly, somebody had written, it's clear it was from the United States, saying, well, you know, there's civil disorder, there's some riots going on. Can we arm ourselves? And the House of Justice says, no, this is not that level of civil disorder that is referred to in the writings. The Baha'is should not be arming themselves or carrying arms. So again, good for us to know. Another exception in those countries where the way they get their food or their clothing is by hunting, right? They're allowed to carry arms, but that's their way of life. That is not our way of life in the United States. And then specific sports like archery, fencing, and marksmanship. You can find this in the notes to the Kitab Aqdas. What do I do as an individual if I'm called upon to fight for my country? So all these wars going on. So the fundamental principle where we begin is obedience to government. Baha'is are told that we must obey our government. the same time, we also learned that we're told not to slay another. So now what do we do? Between a rock and a hard place? The Guardian says, no, what we do is that we are able to reconcile our fundamental spiritual convictions, i.e., not to kill, with our civil obligations, which is to help protect our country in a war. So we do that by applying to serve in a non-combatant capacity. So we don't say, oh, I'm not going to help defend my country. We say, oh, absolutely. I'm a patriot. I want to help defend my country. What can I do to serve? And the Shoghi Effendi gives lots of examples. If that's rejected, then we have to obey the government. But honestly, in that last moment, again, conscience kicks in. If you're faced with somebody and is he going to shoot you or she, or you going to shoot them, at that point, you may decide, I would rather be killed than to kill. But that is at that point entirely left up to our conscience. So again, very interesting. Okay, now to the second bucket of society using force. Now, we said that when somebody attacks me, I should forgive and all of those things and overlook the fault and so on and even serve them. But the community has not only the right, but the duty to punish the criminal. Now, the first thing that the writings point out is that this is not done out of vengeance. So society is not acting out of revenge against this person. The purpose is to warn and deter others from doing the same in order to keep the community safe, protected, and secure. That's the main thing, protection and security. And then Abdu'l-Baha very clearly says that failure to punish a criminal would upset the order of the world, because he says if you start forgiving people who do really bad things, quote, the cruel would be continually ill-treating others and assassinations would continually occur. So true. It's like you're giving people carte blanche, like no matter how heinous a crime you commit, we're just going to forgive you. We're just going to love you. No, that doesn't work. Punish and rehabilitate. So that's the first thing. This is another idea in the writings that I found fascinating, that punishing criminals is a requirement of justice. And this quote sums it all up for me. Abdu'l-Baha says the tent of existence is upheld upon the pillar of justice and not upon forgiveness. The continuance of mankind depends upon justice and not upon forgiveness. So if at present the law of pardon were practiced in all countries, in a short time the world would be disordered and the foundations of human life would crumble. I want to take a moment to reflect for those who are Baha'is in this group. Our local administrative bodies are currently called local spiritual assemblies. In the future, when we as Baha'is have matured as communities and our institutions have matured further, they will be called local houses of justice. And the National Spiritual Assembly will be the National House of Justice. And then we have the Universal House of Justice. So very interesting. A lot of the way our institutions currently treat us is more with love and forgiveness. And it sometimes almost feels like turning a blind eye to things we do that we really shouldn't be doing, like breaking certain laws, because we're not ready. They're not ready. We're not ready. The whole community is not ready. But that's not going to be like this in the future. There's going to come a time when we're no longer the 3-year-old community, we're the 15-year-old community. And we're going to have to step up and live up to the laws and requirements in the way they were revealed. But it's progressive revelation within the revelation itself. I find it, again, fascinating, and so just wanted to have highlighted. Death penalty, big controversial topic. Under Baha'i law, society is technically permitted to apply the death penalty as a means of punishing certain category of criminals, in particular those who commit arson and murder. But That same law also provides for life imprisonment as an alternative. Now, it is up to future legislation by the Universal House of Justice to decide what the actual laws are. So we don't have a Baha'i country right now, so there are no Baha'i laws. And as I prefaced my remarks, these are all laws pertaining to Baha'is, and we don't seek to impose them on others. And when the time comes that we have a Baha'i society, then the Universal House of Justice would legislate. Now, the Shoghi Effendi was asked about this. Many people are horrified by the idea of death penalty, and so this person had written, and Shoghi Effendi confirms that the Kitab Aqdas allows for capital punishment in these certain circumstances, but allows imprisonment as an alternative. And he said this alternative has been provided so that the rigors of such a condemnation of death penalty can be seriously mitigated. And he says Baha'u'llah has given us a choice and has therefore left us free to use our own discretion within certain limitations. So society will decide over time what needs to be done at any period in its evolution. So again, interesting point. Now, how do rulers behave? So first of all, Baha'u'llah exhorts rulers to treat their people with justice and to refrain from using violence or force against their people or otherwise oppressing them. And here is the quotation for you. As we think about this, we must remember that the whole concept of power and authority and why leaders are leaders has been completely recast in the Baha'i revelation. So instead of a ruler being somebody who exercises dominance and control, of which we see a lot in our world today, especially as the world moves more towards authoritarianism, right? We're seeing again a resurgence of this tendency, what the Universal House of Justice referred to in its 2019 message as this weakness in human society that keeps recurring. It's like having being prone to get bronchitis in your chest. Every time you get sick, you get bronchitis. Well, every time the human system gets sick, it seems one of the first things we do is we resort to authoritarianism, this need to dominate and control other people's lives and their resources. But this has been completely reframed. In the faith, the role of leadership and authority is to create an environment in which all can fulfill their potential. It's a radically different approach to leadership. So in that context, you can see that justice wouldn't look like oppressing, committing genocide, committing crimes against humanity, raising taxes prohibitively, et cetera, right? None of this. Would all be categorized as injustice and the diametrically opposite thing from creating an environment in which all can fulfill their potential. Now we get to nation against nation. Okay, what about the use of force by one nation against the other? Preface, I am not going to get into a political conversation about who did what to whom, which country did what to whom, and whether it was right or wrong, but I am going to give you the high principles. And it's not going to be hard for you to extrapolate from this and apply it to pick your war, your war of choice in the world today, to see what you think if we had a Baha'i system, how might that war have been avoided? How might that war have been dealt with? What might we still do today? Okay, so you get to do some work here. Use of force by nation against nation. First rule, I'm going to walk you through the rules. Nations must agree to give up war as a tool of international relations. That already tells you a lot. If you have a problem, if one country has a problem with another country, the solution from the Baha'i perspective is never to resort to war. That is taken off the table as a tool. So, and here's the quote for you. The sovereigns must put away the weapons of war and turn to the instruments of universal reconstruction. Now, that requires, so let's talk Turkey here, as Americans like to say. So what does that mean practically? First of all, it means that all nations have to disarm but disarm simultaneously. This is a key Baha'i concept. It's not the, oh, I'm going to be sweet and kind and my nation's just going to disarm because we're such good people. No. And here's why. I put the quotes here. It will not do if one nation lays down the arms and the others refuse to do so. As long as one nation increases her military and naval budget, another nation will be forced into this crazed competition through her natural and supposed interests. All nations must agree to disarm simultaneously. This is a second quote from Abdul Baha. No nation can follow a peace policy while its neighbor remains warlike. So these smaller countries that are being gobbled up cannot follow a peace policy if their bigger, more powerful neighbors remain warlike. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And there is no justice in that. Again, Baha'is always start from the standpoint of what is the principle involved. And the principle is justice. Bayan, I hope I'm not putting you to sleep. There is no justice in this. Okay, so that is critical. So simultaneously disarm. The second thing is you can't get rid of all your armaments. Every country needs to be able to preserve order within its borders, and for that it needs a certain amount of armaments. So the Baha'i rule is that every country will maintain the amount of arms necessary to preserve that order and get rid of all the rest. So that is part of this picture. Then the next requirement is that all nations agree, having taken this tool off the table of war, to cede, to give up all right to make war to whom? To a collective decision-making world body called a World Parliament. And again, I'm not going to get into details. If you want to ask questions about it, I'm happy to field your questions. I've written a lot about it. I have podcasts that lay out in detail how the World Parliament will be constituted and, who elects it? Will it be democratic? What its authority will it be? The power to legislate in what spheres? Will it take over the whole world? All of these interesting questions. But this is the Baha'i conception. So countries cede all right to make war to a world parliament that is to be representative of all the peoples of the world and be democratically legitimate and have the power to pass international laws that are binding on all nations. The third requirement is that, okay, nations are going to have disputes. Siblings have disputes. We all have disputes. We argue with our friends. So how do we resolve them? We submit all disputes to a world court for adjudication and resolution. But unlike the present world court, this court must have compulsory jurisdiction, meaning all nations have to submit their disputes. There's no option to opt out. The court's judgments must be binding and enforceable. And then the question arises, well, what do you mean enforceable? How do we enforce a judgment? Well, the Baha'i writings also provide for that. There is to be an international standing force that is, again, to which all nations contribute arms and troops, that is going to be under the auspices of the World Parliament and that will act in accordance with predetermined rules that all nations sign on to, and it will be dealt with collectively in the collective interest of humanity. Now, by the way, imagine if we had such a system in place already. All of these wars that have broken out, whether it was when we were sitting watching the Russian army advancing over a couple of months towards the Ukrainian border, whether it's the war in Gaza and the initial attack on Israel and then the war in Gaza, just the fighting writ large, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Tigray in Ethiopia, whether it's the DRC or Myanmar or Yemen, as I say, pick your war, and now Venezuela. Imagine if we had a standing force. Imagine if nations had given up their weapons, had taken the tool of war off the table, had put it in the hands of a world parliament, and so on. Imagine how the story might have been different, and it certainly would have been. Now, the fourth requirement, this is the jewel in the crown of Baha'u'llah's writings on peace, honestly. This is the linchpin of the system. When you read the writings, you'll see that it's so. It's the cornerstone of the foundation. The building of a system of global collective security is an indispensable way of maintaining peace and security. So the writings, there are many quotations by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha about the duty of the rulers of the world to come together to convene an all-inclusive assembly where the only thing on the agenda will be peace, and they will then decide to put away their weapons of war, limit their arms, as we talked about, to what's necessary to ensure order within their borders. And then here is the big clause. Should one ruler rise up against another, all the others must arise to deter him. And the quote, sorry, I was looking to see. Yeah, here it is. The verbiage around this is very interesting. So once this pact, this agreement has been made by these leaders about how to maintain peace in the world and how to limit arms, if any government later violate any one of its provisions, all the governments on earth should arise to reduce it to utter submission, for which you need a force. This is what the standing force is for, but it acts on behalf of who? All of the world. Nay, the human race as a whole should resolve with every power at its disposal to destroy that government. If this principle were in place, none of the wars that we read about daily in the paper would have ever been allowed to get off the ground. As soon as they were budding, this international world would have stood up and said, no, no, you don't. You're about to disturb the peace of the world. We cannot let that happen. We've all agreed. We are all rising against you. You either remedy your ways or we take your government out. Destroy that government, reduce it to utter submission. And here's another quote by Baha'u'llah. Should any king take up arms against another, all should unitedly arise and prevent it. You know, when on the playground, when there was a bully, the only effective way we all learned to deal with a bully wasn't one-on-one, because then I throw a punch and then another person throws a punch against me, and then you divide the playground into people who support the bully and support me, and it's mayhem in the end. The only thing that ever worked, I learned this at school when I was about 11 years old, was you get everybody to stand up to the bully and you literally go up to them as one and you say, oh no, you don't. They back down immediately. Doesn't matter how big or powerful they think they are. They realize the game is up. And Abdu'l-Baha's promise is, should we apply this greatest of all remedies to the sick body of the world, it will assuredly recover from its ills and will remain eternally safe and secure. I would like to highlight at this juncture that this is, according to Shoghi Effendi, one of the features of the lesser peace. Many Baha'is, in my opinion, based on my reading of the writings, and I would urge you to go read for yourselves, misunderstand and think that collective security won't happen until in the future when all souls are transformed. And no, we don't have time. We can't wait for that. We'll have destroyed ourselves 100 times over, as we can see in the world. What we need is a system of collective security. And again, I would refer you to the letter of the Universal House of Justice of 2019, in which they also, again, reaffirm that the creation of a legal order to which most of the nations of the world sign up to. I'm paraphrasing, that will also have a means whereby its rules can be enforced. Basically, a system of collective security is going to have to come soon and will be part of the lesser peace. So it's one of the hallmarks. It's one of the ways we'll know. Baha'is are fond of asking, when will the lesser peace come? We're told it's a process, not an event. But one of its features will be the establishment of a system of collective security. So when you start to see the nations of the world say, okay, guys, we're tired of this, we're just killing each other, and we can't afford it. We can't afford it monetarily. We can't afford to sacrifice our people anymore. And climate change is ravaging us. We have an inequality and poverty. There are other bigger problems to pay attention to. Then we'll know that the lesser peace has come. We talked about the International Standing Force, not going to get into it in details. If you want details, again, I have a podcast, Reimagining Our World podcast on this. But its job will be to enforce international laws passed by the parliament, enforce the judgments of the World Court, and maintain and or restore peace. So all the wars we have today, the Standing Force would have gotten engaged early and nipped it in the bud. The last question. Many people ask, do we really need to resort to force? I mean, surely if humanity has resorted to force, isn't it time to just give up the use of force altogether? So two things. The writings are clear that humanity is not yet mature enough to do completely without force. So we're taking the next step of giving up the use of war as a tool of international relations and all the things about individuals and rulers applying force. But collective force is now what we need at this stage in our collective growth. Secondly, the principle, if you want a principle to hang your hat on, is that force is to be used as a servant of justice. Those are the words of the Guardian and Abdu'l-Baha. Force is to be used as a servant of justice. What is justice? Abdu'l-Baha has this to say. He says there are times when engaging in war is the just and merciful thing to do, and it's necessary to restore peace. And so a leader wages war for a righteous purpose. And then he gives two examples. So in case you're wondering, well, what could that look like? Well, here's according to Abdu'l-Baha. One, he says, is when an aggressor nation comes and starts attacking, right? Then the leader who stands up and takes their armies and stands up to that aggressor is waging a righteous war for a righteous purpose. Very interesting, as I said, in the context of everything going on in our world today. Secondly, he says, a leader who arises to stop his nation from being divided and broken up into fragments, that leader is waging a righteous war. So I think of Abraham Lincoln and fighting the Civil War to maintain the unity of this nation, right? The United States. And what it cost us, but how strong it made us, at least for a whole bunch of years. And now we haven't been paying attention to our social fabric, so it's fraying. And then another quote from Abdu'l-Baha, conquest can be a praiseworthy thing, and there are times when war becomes the powerful basis of peace and ruin the very means of reconstruction. And I gave you those examples. So the analogy that I like to think of is when we have cancer in the body. So this is when these people come and create conflict in the world and start wars. That's like cancer in the body of the world. We use chemotherapy, which is a very harsh treatment that kills those cells, but also kills some good cells. So we're going to lose some good people. But it's either that or lose the patient, right? We can't afford to lose the patient. Can't let order in the world crumble. And that's it. If you want further information on any of these topics, there are the books, Building a World Federation, The Key to Resolving Our Global Crises, and The Alchemy of Peace. They're available at the Baha'i Bookstore and on Amazon. And something you might enjoy for free is the Reimagining Our World podcast that is available on our platforms. It covers these nuggets and takes, 20, 25 minutes to treat each subject. Thank you for your patience, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Sovaida, for your talk. It was so comprehensive, and you anticipated a lot of our questions, I think, including mine. But nonetheless, we already have a bunch of questions. So if anybody has any questions, they can put it in the chat. One question asks, I guess this is about individual relations. What can we do when we desire to ask forgiveness to someone that we've offended in a strong relationship, and that person is a Baha'i, but indeed they don't want to be in contact with you?
Yep, that's fine. We can't control other people. There's a principle that we use in coaching, say what we say and do, what I say and do is about me. What the other person says and does is about them. Our only responsibility is for us to do the right thing by ourselves. So forgiveness in this instance is the right thing to do from a spiritual point of view, but also for our own spiritual growth. And once we've done it, if as long as our motive is pure and we've done it with love, that's it. The other person gets to respond however they want to. And if they don't want to talk to us, that's fine. They may or may not change their minds, but we can't now get offended about them because now we've started a whole nother thing going, right? The whole point, remember, was to understand and not get offended. You and I don't know what's going on in that person's head, their makeup, their past experiences, their filters through which they interpret the world. They've got their spiritual growth to undergo. We don't judge them. We don't worry about it. You've done your bit. Move on. There are many other people in the world.
What about engaging in academic discourse that could be construed as debate? Is that something that Baha'is can participate in?
So academic discourse, so we're talking about acrimonious debate, not debate as in, so debate can be consultation, right? It can be a vigorous debate where you throw out an idea and someone says, well, I'm not really sure, I don't agree. That is actually consultation. You know, Baha'is don't like to do consultation because we think just agreeing with everybody is the sweet thing to do. But I was, by the way, listening to a talk last night by former member of the Universal House of Justice, Ali Nakhjavani. Somebody had asked him, what was your favorite memory about Ruqya Khanum? I know this sounds like it's going afield, but you'll see where I'm going in a second here, who was the wife of Shoghi Effendi. And he said his favorite thing was that when the Universal House of Justice was elected after the period where a few individuals at the head of the faith held reign during a transitional period after the death of the head of the faith, Shoghi Effendi. The Universal House of Justice had told Ruqya Khanum that whenever you want, feel free to come and meet with us, the Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme governing body of the Baha'i faith. And he said she would always ask for permission, but he said she would show up and she had very strong views and opinions about everything and would say, I feel very strongly about this, and this. She didn't hold back because really, under Baha'i principles of consultation, Abdul Baha tells us that that's what we're supposed to do, is to put forward things that we strongly feel is our opinion, but to put it forward and then be detached from it. And he said when she'd put it out there with determination, with force, but then she said, whatever you decide, I will obey. And she did. Whatever their decision was, whether they took into account what she said or not, she obeyed. That is the Baha'i way. And the same applies. We should be taking that into our academic debates. So absolutely debate vigorously. Someone else raises something, it's like, well, that doesn't seem to make much sense for the following reasons. How about this? And you go back and forth and back and forth. And as Abdul-Baha says, through the clash of differing opinions, eventually the spark of truth will be made evident. Maybe eventually a paper will come out that you or others will write that where they came up with an idea based on this vigorous debate. But we should not be shying away from academic, I would call it vigorous consultations, debates. It's acrimonious debate. And when it just descends to just pure argumentation and there's nothing valuable to be gleaned from it, and we all know when any conversation gets there where ears are shut on all fronts and there's no exchange anymore, it's just trying to cram something down someone's throat. And it's getting very unpleasant. That's what we're not supposed to do. So I hope it didn't create any confusion.
Thank you. Another question asks, can we carry mace for our self-defense?
Carry mace. So is mace considered a weapon? So here's a conscience thing, okay? In many jurisdictions, carrying mace is illegal, like in where I live, the District of Columbia. I know people do it, but they're actually breaking the law. So first of all, I would look at the laws in the jurisdiction in which you live. If the law says you're not allowed to, then as a Baha'i, obedience to government. That trumps everything. In places that allow it, so like carrying arms, there are many states that allow you to carry guns or whatever. Does that mean Baha'is do it? No, because we have our own rule, no weapons. To my mind, now this is Sovaida, I've not seen anything specific about the use of mace in the writings. You can always write and ask about it, but it's a weapon. So I would not carry it. But I think it's a question of conscience. It's so.
Another question asks, why was retribution allowed in previous dispensations?
You'll have to go talk to those revealers of those revelations. No, I'm partly kidding. Humanity, through its evolution, as Shaykh Effendi says, has been going through different stages of growth. So what is appropriate for a 3-year-old to do and a 6 is different from a 6-year-old, 9-year-old, 12-year-old. So humanity was more less mature. Circumstances of life were also very different. People lived in very harsh environments, and they were used to certain habits of behavior. And with coming of each prophet, they tried to take humanity a couple of steps further up the chain, but they couldn't disband everything, and humanity wasn't ready for it. Like Jesus Christ says, I have many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now. I will send unto you the Spirit of truth, the Holy Counselor, and he, Baha'u'llah, eventually will bring you to all truth. So they had to pitch the message to the capacity of humanity to take it on board. If it had been too much, human beings would have completely rejected beyond what they already did, all the messengers of God. They would have said, okay, this is just ridiculous, the stuff they're trying to get us to do. So
Thank you. Another question asks, what might a Baha'i do if one has a personal grievance against law enforcement, that they were jailed on false charges because officers were incentivized by their justice system and the profit-based prison industry to make a certain number of arrests per week or month?
yeah, take it to a higher authority and keep going up the chain if you can. That seems to be the recommendation from everything I see in the writings. When a wrong is done, you appeal to a legal authority. Um, and I know, look, this is where, to me, also what the greatest holy leaf said about we're engaged in something. So we're dealing with injustices, which are very real and affect lives, but we're also trying to role model and demonstrate to the world that there's a different way of doing things, right? So getting a wrong redressed is important. And if we could also do something else while we're getting the wrong redressed, which is to demonstrate our spirit of respect and wanting to engage in constructive consultation on a topic that affects the lives of many, about injustices that affect many, and to demonstrate that this can be done in that spirit, then people will learn that they don't need to be afraid of having these conversations, and they don't need to be afraid of people who approach them and say, hey, listen, something really terrible happened. I'd like to discuss this with you, and I'd like to get redress, but can we do this in the spirit of respect and courtesy, right? So that's all I have to offer. Again, these are just my personal views. Thank God we don't have clergy in the faith. So my views are as good as your views, as long as my views and your views are informed by the Baha'i writings. That's all. And if we get stuck and don't really know, we also have the other amazing gift to write to our own institutions and ask for guidance, like to our National Spiritual Assembly, hey, or start with the local Spiritual Assembly and then the National Spiritual Assembly. Say to them exactly what you said here. What would you suggest that I do? What is the best? Can I consult with you about the best way to approach this? And take them into your confidence. So,
Thank you. Considering how so many countries today are not just reluctant, but vehemently opposed to yield any power to a central authority, will it take some kind of global disastrous war before all nations agree to these conditions?
It would seem so. I don't know about war, but it's the global disasters, and it may not be limited to one thing. My own sense is it's likely to be several things coming together to squeeze us in a vise. And why do I say this? Shoghi Effendi in the World Order of Baha'u'llah says that the kinds of major changes in the world, when we look historically, have never come about just as a result of education and diplomacy, but have come about as a result of intense mental and physical agony. And then we have all these other quotations, including a quote from The Guardian in which he says, at some point we'll get to the point where there will be tremendous convulsions that will be widespread, universal, long-lasting, and will basically will bring about things that he says we can't even begin to imagine. So yes, I think suffering is going to be the key. Unfortunately, it didn't have to be that way, but it's the choice that humanity's made by being unheeding and being stubborn and choosing to go down this path of self-destruction. So we're doing this to ourselves. And the the silver lining to the suffering is another quote from Shoghi Effendi in which he says, suffering will lead to several things. Disillusionment of the masses. So, by the way, when I look at right now protests in Iran, protests in you pick your country, people are getting disillusioned when they feel they have nothing more to lose. Life is so bad, can't put food on the table. Tehran is running out of water. 10 million people. They want to like move them to another part of the country. I mean, things that are just, the mind boggles. In our country here, people are upset because of the affordability issue and health insurance costs, or you start to look at nations, this state of Venezuela, of Sudan, of DRC, what people are going through. People are becoming disillusioned in the masses. So the Guardian says that will happen as a result of suffering. Then he says our conscience will be stirred as a result of the suffering. And then once the conscience is stirred, in addition, then we will be willing at that point to answer the person's question, to radically reconceptualize what we mean by society. So that's what we need, a radical reconceptualization, the willingness to radically reconceptualize. And we're getting there. At some point, Abdul Baha has a quote that says, we will be brought to our knees. We won't have an option. Things will get so bad that we'll realize, oh gosh. And by the way, the famous historian Arnold Toynbee predicted that that would happen, that when humanity was faced with an existential crisis, it would turn on a dime. And this, what he called this allergy to any form of world government, would disappear overnight. He said it's just a bad habit. And when we're faced with annihilation, we will turn on a dime and we will embrace it, albeit kicking and screaming, but we will adopt some form of limited world government. So the Baha'is need to be ready. Before apartheid ended in South Africa, nobody saw it coming. All the experts, when I talked to them later, they'd been studying it for years. None of them saw the timing of when it would happen. Fall of the Berlin Wall, same thing. All these experts and the Cold War and Russia-US relations and blah, blah, blah. None of them saw the time. They were all surprised when it happened. So we need to have faith when our writings tell us that something's going to happen. It's going to happen. Again, that statement from the Universal House of Justice in the 2019 letter, they talk about the fact that the world right now seems to be going backwards. And you remember that phrase, the one sentence, three-word sentence? So be it. So be it. And then the next sentence is, we as Baha'is know, we have faith, God has promised that this thing is going to happen. This peace is coming. This new system is coming. We know it's coming. It may be delayed for a while, but it's coming. So we need to work as though that thing is done and we're preparing for it. So that's where our heads need to be. The rest is all fluff. This is all the ocean, the froth on the ocean. We are sort of the depths of the ocean. We're looking at the the coral and the reef and the fish, and we're building something else. And meanwhile, the surface is turbulent, and the turbulence comes and the turbulence goes, and some days it's calm, and there's a typhoon here and a cyclone there. We mind our business. We keep our heads down and keep going.
Thank you. Another question asks, while as a Baha'i I understand the principle to love and forgive my enemies, how can I explain the wisdom of this principle to people from war-stricken areas like Ukraine, who have lost many lives, including innocent children, in the disastrous war imposed by Russia on them, when they ask our view as a Baha'i about the war and enemy?
Okay, so yes, that would be, in some sense, almost an insulting thing to say to Ukrainian, and it would be a half-baked answer. Their job, I would, the conversation I would engage with them on is, yes, this demonstrates the need for a system of collective security in the world. That is the principle here that is the most useful and that we need to work towards. You're absolutely right. Your nation has been absolutely devastated, and the world is not currently, its institutions are not grounded in a system of justice. So that's what we need to change. The Baha'is have some ideas about what that looks like. I'd like to share with you the ideas about Baha'u'llah's system of collective security, which would have averted the war in your country and so on and so forth. I would not go to them and say, oh, you really need to be forgiving as an individual. That's not for us. And that each of us is responsible for ourselves. And I also preface this by saying that these principles and laws are for Baha'is who've espoused it, right? I know you said the person asked you, but wisdom is really important here. And I would start again with what Baha'u'llah has truly brought with is, which is the system of collective security and the oneness and the principle of the oneness of humanity, learning to recognize that we're all one human being, whether I'm Russian or Ukrainian or whatever. You start there, and eventually one can work one's way up to recognizing that because of that, that God loves this other person, this Russian, as much as they love me. I recognize that, I'm connected with them, and my job in life, when I also understand that I have a soul, there's so many conversations to have before the conversation on you need to forgive. The conversation about what a human being is, the nature of the human being, that we are souls, that we're on a spiritual journey, about life after death, of what our purpose is in this life. And then eventually you get to a point of why forgiveness helps my spiritual growth. So if I'm thinking about eternal life, we don't allow people to frame conversations for you and then feel trapped in them. You then go and say, well, that's a really interesting question. And then you frame the conversation in a way that can build up to giving them the answer that they're looking for.
Thank you. So it looks like that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you again, Miss Maani Ewing, for this amazing talk. It was really fascinating, and it's a lot to think about, especially with all the world events going on right now. So we should all be watching and rewatching this talk and sharing with our friends. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Bayan, and thank you all for being here today, for your patience.
So our speaker next week is going to be Dr. Sohrab Kurosh, and his topic is Baha'i Revelation, Creating New Social Realities. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern Time, so you can invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the chat and the YouTube description box. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you next week. Have a great weekend.